Hello, my name is Xander and welcome to another FastAPI tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be utilizing GraphQL to develop a small API that we can send and receive data from. So ultimately, this tutorial serves as a baseline to help you get started utilizing FastAPI and GraphQL. Now, we are using other associated technologies. So here we're going to use GraphQL to create a method of getting and posting data through our API and saving it to our database. We are going to be utilizing FastAPI with Uvicorn as our server. And we go through the process again of setting up SQLAlchemy and Alembic so that we can migrate our data easily to our Postgres database. In addition to that, we'll go through the Docker process again, setting up PostgreSQL, PGAdmin, and our application. So if you have seen the previous tutorial from this, we did go through this process using REST. Here we're just going to essentially do exactly the same thing, but using GraphQL. If you would like to follow this tutorial, you are going to need Docker Desktop installed. So go ahead and download that. You'll probably need to restart the computer. On my environment, I'm running 3.9, Python, and Windows 10. There are a few points here where some of the configurations might be different for a Mac and Linux machine. I'll give you some pointers as we go along. So unlike the previous tutorial, if you've seen that, I took you through how to get started from the repository. So I'm not going to do that in this tutorial. If you are interested in just getting a project like this started, then head back to that previous tutorial. The link is in the description of the video. So we're going to go straight ahead to Docker PostgreSQL PGAdmin setup. If you have seen the previous tutorial, it's exactly the same. So you can skip that part, have a look in the timeline in the video description, and then we go ahead and start building with GraphQL. So here's just a view of the final outcome. We're going to build an API that allows us to create new posts for a blog application or blog API, for example. So here, for example, we can go ahead and add a new blog or blog post. So we add some more blog posts. So let's just add a few more. Okay, so now I've got 4 blog posts. So we'll be able to send data through our API and save it to our database. So a mutation, then we can go ahead, of course, and have a look to see what we've just added to the database. There we go. And in addition to that, I'll take you through how to select individual items from the database. And there we go. So what we have is an API whereby you can now send or create posts, new posts for your blog. You can now grab all the blog posts from your database through your API and then also select individual blog posts. So that's pretty much what we're going to be building in this tutorial. So first up, we're going to go through the Docker PostgreSQL PGAdmin setup. So if you do want to skip this, you can use the link in the video description and go ahead to the development section. So if you are new to Docker, just make sure you've got this installed. So go to the Docker website, download and install the Docker Desktop, and then we can go through the process. So here we're going to open up a new project, file, open folder, make a new folder, open that folder in Visual Studio Code. And you can see now we have this folder. This is our working folder over here. And now we can start building. So the first thing we want to do is let's create a new file here. So that's going to be a Docker Compose file. So if you haven't used Docker Compose before, this allows us to describe all the services that we want to build. So what we're going to have is we're going to build a cluster of containers. We're going to have a container for our database, a container for DBAdmin, our database admin tool that we're going to utilize. And then we have a separate container for our application, our API that we're running. So we want to basically just describe that within our Docker Compose file. So just to quickly take you through this, first of all, then we have the version. So like I previously mentioned, this is essentially the version of code that we're utilizing here in Docker Compose. We're currently utilizing 3.8, so all the syntax here and format is related to the version 3.8 of kind of Docker syntax, if you like. And then we have some services. So we're going to describe the services that we need to build. One's going to be a database. One of them is going to be our admin, PGAdmin tool. That's going to help us manage our database through a web-based interface. And then we're also going to build an app. But let's just focus first on our database. So I like to call my containers names. I like to give my containers names, sorry. So my Postgres database container is going to be called PostgreSQL_DB. Now we have an image. So if you're new to Docker, and I'm assuming that you might be going through this is an image. So what we're going to do here is we're going to tell Docker to pull down the official Postgres image. So if you go to Docker Hub, you'll find that on that website there are thousands and thousands of pre-created images. So think of an image as a pre-created environment, including an operating system and the software that you want to run, all in one file. And we can use that image to create a container, so a live running computer, if you like, inside of a container. And inside of that container, we'll run all the software that's on that image, that's been already preloaded on that image that we're using to run the container. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, and it might be worth, if you're not too familiar with Docker, spending some time later understanding that maybe a little bit further. But here, basically, we're going to download the Postgres, the official Postgres image from Docker Hub. That comes with everything already created for us, all on one little image that we can build a container and run our database. So ultimately, this prevents us from having to actually install the operating system and, the database software onto our computer. We can just run it within a container. So that's essentially what we're doing here. And then restart always. So I just set this option so that if the container does fail, it would just start up again, because if this service doesn't have a database, your API isn't going to work. So we always want to make sure that the database is on. And now we're going to map some ports. So this is a container in our computer. Now there's no way in and there's no way out unless we specify how to get in that container. Now this container, our database container, is running our database. We want to be able to access that database through other services. So what we're doing here is we're mapping this port. This port is 5432. Think of this as a doorway. So this is door 5432, and that doorway is going to open a door inside of this container where our database is running. And this database is looking for this port and check and see if there's any data being passed through that port. And it's going to be captured and funneled to our database so it can deal with the requests maybe that we're sending from our API. So that's just basically a doorway into our container, these ports. We're mapping our computer port 5432 to the port on this container 5432. So that essentially means that any data we send to this port on our computer is going to be funneled through this port here into this container so that we can build a connection to our database. Right, so now we're going to set up some environment variables. Now this database is going to need a user. So we're going to set up some environment variables in a second. So this is going to be called dbuser. We set a password for our database. Now Postgres user by default is going to be called Postgres. We can't change that just for now. So that's what we're going to set up. A password can be absolutely anything. So we're just going to set up these variables here. We're going to pass in some environment variables in a second. And then we're also going to need a new database. So we create a new database name. So that will create a new database when we run our container. Right, so what we're going to need to do here is going to pass in some environment variables. So what's happening here is that if I were to load this up, if I were to push this over to GitHub, if I want to store this on GitHub, then the idea is that I don't want the rest of the team knowing all these, or other people knowing my username and passwords for all of my software that I have and all the other services that I'm running. So the idea here is to create an environment file which won't get uploaded to GitHub, that I can keep secure and safe on my computer or wherever, and then just essentially load that onto the server. If I were to take this into production, then that would be hidden behind the scenes, but still accessible by these softwares. And that's just a way of kind of hiding some of these important details that you don't want other people knowing. So what we're going to need to do here is we're just going to need to pass in these, set up these variables that we've defined here, dbuser, dbpassword, and dbname. So if we put those in there, you can see the user is Postgres, the password is going to be password, and my database name is going to be bookdb. So maybe I need to change that to blog database. Okay, so that's my database name. Cool. Right, so now I've got that in place. Let's go back. So that's my That's going to be the database sorted. Now I'm going to run PGAdmin. So if you haven't run PGAdmin before, it's a web-based GUI interface, graphical user interface, that allows us to interface with our database, and we can control and manage our database from this tool. So here we're going to pull down the image like we've done with Postgres. We'll go ahead and give this container a name, and then we set up some environment variables again from our env file. So that's going to be a username and password to actually enter this software. And then we're going to map a port so we can actually access this service. So notice here that Postgres is running on this 5432 port. That's where we're sending the data to store and retrieve from a database. But here, for example, we're passing port 5050 over to port 80 on this container. So this is a web-based service. So it runs on port 80. So we're going to pass over this port from our local machine 5050 over to this container in order to access this service. Right, so that's pretty much all we need at this point. So what's going to happen here is that Docker is going to pick up these environment variables as we work and run our new containers. So we don't need to do anything else here. That's just going to be all passed in. Now we do need to update this with PGAdmin before I forget. So we're going to pass in the PGAdmin email, the default login and password. So that's basically just the default username and password. Right, so now when we go ahead and actually load this up, so let's go in and run docker compose. So we're going to start this all up. So I'll just start up Docker desktop. So this is my Docker desktop screen. I can't make it any smaller than this, do apologize. Okay, so you can see I've got nothing running at the moment with images and containers. So let's just go ahead and run docker compose up. What's going to happen now is these images here that we specified, they're going to be downloaded. And once they're downloaded, it's then going to run a container from those images and set these environment variables. And that's the username and passwords that we set so we can access the services. In addition to that, when the services are running, these ports will get applied to the containers so we can access the services in the containers. So you can see that's going to take quite some time. There's a lot to download. These two images can be quite large, so it might take a few minutes. So once it's done, you're going to see in the terminal here the fact that the services are trying to run, and this is basically the output from the containers. You can see all the different management outputs here. So what happens now is if you go into your container apps, you can see that you've got this cluster of containers running. You've got your PGAdmin and your Postgres database. So now we can go ahead and check to see if this is actually working. So if you remember, our PGAdmin had a port of 5050. That's going to take us over to our container. So essentially we've now moved into that container. We're looking at the services that are running in that container, and we're accessing it through the port that we've defined. So here the username was admin@admin.com and the password was admin. That allows us to log into PGAdmin. Now, the next step is we just need to hook PGAdmin to our database. So I select servers and then add new server. So I'm just going to call this DB. Connection is going to be DB. So this is the name of the service that we created. So that just allows me to easily access the service from the service name rather than the IP address, which this container does have an IP address. I could utilize that if I wanted to, but I'm just going to use the name of the service to access this service. So host name address is DB. Now this is a port number, so we don't need to do anything there. And then the username was Postgres and the password was password, which you can change, of course. So I save that. You can now see we're connected to our database. So have a look at our databases. You can see we've got one called blog database. And at the moment, if I go into schemas, that allows me to access tables. There aren't any tables in this database at the moment. So that's the case. That should be the case. So let's go ahead now and configure our API. Okay, so you can go ahead and close down these services. You can press Ctrl+C here. That will close down the containers in Docker. You see that they're starting to be closed, and we might as well go ahead and just delete. So we can delete these containers if we want to, either individually, all of them all at once. So we'll just leave it in that state for now. Now these are images that have been pulled down. We can just utilize those later, so we don't need to delete those at all. So let's now go ahead and think about our application. So let's just start this off by, because we're working with Docker, we may as well just complete this. Now let's go ahead and just create a new file called Docker file. And inside of here, we're going to describe our application, or setting up our application that we want to run within Docker. So from here, we want to go through a process, and that process is going to be copying across all these files here to a new app image so that we can run our FastAPI GraphQL implementation. And so we want to copy everything across, and then we want to run that on an image. So we're going to need Python so we can run the official Python image. So the first thing we can do is just set up this file here. So from Python 3. So that is an image describing an image, a Python image that has an operating system and Python installed. And that's going to be built into a container where we're going to run our API. So we can set some environment variables. So this is going to allow us just to output directly to the terminal. We can then go ahead and set up a new working directory on our container where we can store our application. So we set that up. So once we know that we've set our application folder, we're going to need to move across a requirements file, which we'll build shortly. So we move across the requirements file over to our image and to our container. Then we're going to need to run our update. We don't have to, but we can run an update of pip, and then we can go ahead and install all the dependencies or the libraries that we're going to need to run our API. So this is just a process that we need to go through here in Docker to build our application and have it run in our container. So let's go ahead and just now copy everything across to this new folder we created on our container, if you like. And then we can go ahead and just expose a port so we can actually access our service. So we're going to expose port 8000. You can change it if you'd like. Be careful not to select a protected port. So here we're going to use 8000. So I'm going to be able to access my API through 8000 port. Right, so that pretty much describes the flow of how I want to set my application and ready an image so that I can then make that into a container, and that would then have my application, my API running in a container. So with that said, let's go ahead now and just update our Docker Compose file. So next up then, let's just create a new service here. We're going to call this app, and then we're going to have a container name of app build. So this build is referring to dot, which is referring to this file here. So it's looking for this Docker file. Essentially, it's going to run this Docker file. It's going to run all these commands here, and that's going to build in our image, if you like. It's going to copy across the requirements file. It's going to install everything that's needed, copy across all the files here, and then expose. So that's basically just setting up everything that we need to run our container. And then we're going to run this command. So when everything starts up, we're going to run this command. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just make sure that everything is up to date in terms of our tables. So we're going to run Alembic, which is basically the migration tool that we're going to be utilizing to migrate our tables to our database. And then we're going to run Uvicorn here, our server, and we're going to select our main app and then run it on 000 port 8000. So that's basically just starting our server and running our application, our API. So that's the command that's going to sort all that out for us. And we are going to mirror the volume from our container to our local machine here. So anything we do here in our local machine is going to be updated in our container. And that allows us to work live in a live kind of situation in our container in Docker. So that's going to happen there. And then we just map across the 8000 ports, and then we just make sure that is dependent upon the DB. So using depend on here, it just allows us to describe how to essentially set up our containers, because we know that really our database should load first before we load our application, because our application is dependent upon our database. So it depends on, basically just creates a dependency, a loading dependency, so that our database loads first before our app. Right, let's move this back, and there we go. Right, so that pretty much sorts out all of the Docker file and the Docker Compose file. All I need to do now is run Docker Compose up, which I'm not going to do just yet because we now need to actually build the application. So now we've gone through the Docker PostgreSQL PGAdmin setup, as well as setting up the Docker Compose and Docker file for our application. Let's now move across to FastAPI GraphQL development. So if you have skipped a step and you've gone directly to this section here, just make sure you copy across the Docker Compose and Docker file from the repository as well as the environment variable folder, and we're ready to set up our FastAPI and GraphQL implementation. So first of all, we're going to need a virtual machine. So we're going to work in a virtual machine. If you're not too sure what that is, basically we're just going to build a lightweight virtual environment that's going to store our application so that we don't have to worry about it conflicting with our main operating system files and Python installation and so on. So we're just working within a small environment, in a small virtual environment area. So this is where it's going to be slightly different, and probably the only step that's slightly different if you're running Linux and Mac. This is going to be a slightly different command. So here I'm on Windows, don't forget. So just go over to Google and type in how to set up a virtual environment in Mac or Linux and go through that process. So that's going to take a couple of seconds to load all that up. Once you're done, let's just go ahead. I'm using tab here to find the files or name of folders. So we're going to start or activate our virtual environment. Now we're inside of the virtual environment, so now we can work within this environment. So I've created a file here called commands.md, and inside of here is pretty much all the commands that we're going to be utilizing, as well as some of the mutations and queries, just to make it easy for you to access some of those different things that I type in. All right, so you can see here, this is all of the libraries that we're going to need to get our application started. So we'll just go ahead and pip install all of these. So they should all run directly. So while they're running, you can see we're running FastAPI, Uvicorn, which is our server, SQLAlchemy, that's going to help us manage our database. So instead of having to write SQL, we can utilize classes, Python, and that will then get converted into SQL, ready for it to be inserted or communicating with our database. So Graphene here, so this is the implementation of, this is going to allow us to work with GraphQL, Graphene library. So we're also utilizing Graphene SQLAlchemy to allow a little bit of compatibility between those tools. Alembic here, that's going to allow us to make migrations, easily make migrations from our models and then create our actual tables in our database and update them and so on. So we need the connection information, we need to the management commands, we need to know how to communicate with Postgres database. So this is going to allow us to do that. Black, that's just a little bit of formatting. If you're not familiar with Black, there is a tutorial on Black, what it is, etc. This is going to allow us to follow Python code conventions. So I'm just going to quickly slip in a VS Code settings file here. So this is a settings file that I'm using. You can have a look at the repository for this. So this basically just sets up Black to auto format my code, just in case you're wondering what that is. But there is a tutorial. Let me just close that on the channel if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Right, so that's in place. You'll find that in the repository. That's not going to be dependent on whether you get your application working or not. That's just something that I'm working with here. Right, so I'm then going to run that. So we've run that and we've got the python.env, sorry. So that's the last thing here. That's just going to allow us to load up environment variables whilst we're working in this environment here. Now, when we go over to a development server, we'll obviously insert our environment variables differently so that we can access these environment variables in our application. But essentially this tool here is going to allow us to load up our environment file in our server so we can access these environment variables. Right, so that's pretty much all the applications that or libraries that we're utilizing here. So now they have been installed, let's go ahead and create a new file called main. While we're at it, actually, let's go ahead and pip freeze. So let's make a requirement file. Requirement text file. So that's our requirement text file. So this is all the libraries that we've just installed. So that should match up nicely to our Docker file. So here, remember our requirements.txt. That's what we're going to copy across first or initially, and then load all those libraries onto our Docker implementation. Right, so now we've got this file here. Let's go ahead and also create another new file. So I guess where we're going to need to start is our models. So we're just going to build a very simple model. There's going to be no foreign keys here or anything like that. It's just going to be a single model. So I did use a foreign key, etc. set up in the previous tutorial. So if you are interested in that, it's worth going back, and I'll show you how to do that in that previous tutorial. So let's go ahead and build a new file here called models.py, and we'll start there. So let's go ahead now and just build our post table. Right, so we start off by bringing in from SQLAlchemy column, date, time, integer, and string. And these are the tools that allows us to describe our model so that it can then get converted, if you like, into SQL and then inserted or created in the database. So we're also bringing from SQLAlchemy import func. So that's going to allow us to build our date time. So in the previous tutorial, we were using or reusing code quite a lot. So here's trying to be a little bit progressive here. If you have seen the previous tutorial, you don't need to go into the previous tutorial to understand this, but I'll just try to make it a little bit progressive. So here we're going to create a new file called dbconf, and we're going to import some of the tools from there because we can then reuse that code in other files. So that's going to import base that we're going to need to utilize here in our class to describe our table. So here we build our first and only table called post. So this is a table name, and we describe the table name below. And now we're going to build all the fields inside of our table. So first it's going to be an integer ID. So this is going to be our primary key. And then we're going to have a title, which is going to be a string, author string, content string, and then time created. So that's going to take the time directly. So that's not anything we need to pass into the table. That's just going to be automatically generated from the server. Right, so that's set up. That's now defined our model. That's pretty much all we're going to be utilizing in this tutorial. So at this point, we need to create a new file here called dbconfig if you haven't already. And I've gone ahead now, imported the declarative base, and I brought that in and I've assigned that to base. So that's now going to be utilized in our model. So just to review again, apologies to kind of embellish this. Here we're building a table. Now we are using Python. So the idea here is that we don't use SQL. We use other tools such as SQLAlchemy, and that's going to help us translate our Python code into SQL, which can then be utilized by our database to build this table. That's essentially what we're doing here. So we're going to be utilizing other tools like Alembic, and that's going to allow us to create migrations, actually take this table and convert it, apply it, into our database. So we'll talk about that shortly, but we've got our base in now. We've then configured it here. If you want to learn a little bit more about this declarative base, by all means go over to the SQLAlchemy documentation and then have a little look. But that's essentially what we're doing here. It just allows us to describe our model so it can then be processed further. So the next step is that we're going to need to actually get this table that we've described here in our database. So here we're going to be utilizing Alembic. So if you go over to your commands again, you've got this command here. This is going to initiate Alembic. So let's go into our terminal. And so get in the terminal if you're not familiar, I press Control and comma. You can just drag from the bottom here, and that'll bring it up. If you're not familiar with that, do apologize if you've not used it before. So let's go ahead now and just run this command. What's going to happen, a new folder is going to appear with all the setup. There we go. So this tool here is going to allow us to make a migration. It's going to essentially take our model, prepare our model first, and ready it so it can then be migrated, actually applied to our database. So now this is set up, we need to just go through a quick process here of, I just like removing all this, just makes it a lot clearer. So bear with me a second. I realize you don't want to watch a video of someone removing comments. So let's just on line 7 now, the SQLAlchemy URL. So this is basically a link here to our database. This is how we connect to our database through Alembic. So we want to just basically get rid of that for now. We won't need that. We'll sort that out in a second. Okay, so that pretty much sums that up. I've removed all that text, that additional comments. We're not going to need that. And that leaves you with this file here. Right, so from here, there's absolutely nothing that we need to do other than remove that. So let's now move over to the Alembic folder. And we need to move into the environment folder here. So here's some more settings. Right, so here we're going to add some more configuration. So what we need to do here is we need to include that connection to our database. So that's the one thing that we definitely need to do. So from the top, let's first of all bring in OS, because the problem is here, if we look for the file, the environment file, where we're going to actually put the connection to the database, we can't access it at the moment through this file. So what we're going to do is just set up so we can. So we're going to need to bring in addition to that, the .env. So we need to import the .env. So this is the library that we installed earlier, .env. So what we're doing here is we're bringing in load.env. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this folder file here with all our environment variables. And essentially we're going to use this tool to load up our variables so that we can access them from our server. So let me just put this all in place. So we do a bit of this, and then we're going to basically just identify the base directory. So we're going to bring that in. So here we're going to set up the base directory. So what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to find the root directory of our project so we can then find this file here and run it. So now we've set the base directory up, we can now use our load .env to actually load the file. So we found the base directory. We're going to utilize it here to make a join in order to access this file, and we're going to load up the environment file into our server. So now these environment variables are now set in our server. We can now access them, or at least this library can access it now. So what we need to do here is we just need to add in now our database string. So this is like the important string that's utilized by our application in a number of places in order to access our database. So the PostgreSQL database, now we're using it, we installed this package or library earlier if you remember, and that's all the toolkit that we're going to need in order to actually communicate effectively with our database. So here we have the name, the username. This is the password. So that needs to match up, the password. Then we have our DB, that's the DB service, and this is the port number. So DB is referring here to our Docker service, and this is the port number that we've defined here in our Docker Compose. And then finally, it's the name of the database we want to access. So that's going to be PostDB. So let's just make sure we change that. So this code was just being utilized in the previous tutorial. That's why it says, I think it was by the previous tutorial, BlogDB. Okay, so now that's in place, and we've changed the name of our tables. We should now be able to access the database. Okay, so we need to access database URL, back in our environment file here. So we've grabbed the environment file, we've loaded that up in our server. So next thing to do would be to now just actually make that connection to that environment variable. So we need to set this. So config.setMain option SQLAlchemy URL. So we're setting the SQLAlchemy URL. Essentially we're just not overriding, but we're basically just adding this in so it can be accessed, and we're just doing that through this script here. So this is why we removed it from the alembic.ini file here. So we're just going to load it up here. So we're going to set the main option SQLAlchemy URL, and we're going to set it to our OS environ. So here we're going to get the environment variable from our environment file, which has already been loaded into our server, and that's the database URL, which if you look in here, it's called the database URL. So we're just basically grabbing this. Right, so with that in place, database URL, that now sets up our database URL. Actually, there's one thing that we need to do. We need to import our models. So the target metadata, essentially that's the model that we set up here. So let's import models. That's going to bring in this our models, so we can then access the models and make that the target metadata. So models.base.metadata. So here we're just essentially flagging anything that's been flagged as base. I'd like to think we're going to basically say anything inside of this file here is part of the models that we want to configure and actually apply to our database. So that's the target metadata. Models, base, and then metadata. Right. So that imports our models. That now is made a connection to our models so that we know what models we want to migrate to our database. So let's just finish off this phase by padding out here and defining our database configuration. So we are going to, inside of here, utilize our environment variables. So let's bring in OS again, and let's, from the .env, let's load .env, so we can basically just load these environment variables again so we can access them. And then, yep, let's go ahead and just load those up. Okay, so we'll just load this file in. So this time we don't need to know the base directory because we are here. Look, this is where our file is, so it's relative to this environment folder here. So we're just going to load that up. And from there, we're going to define the SQLAlchemy database URL. Okay, so that just allows database connectivity. So essentially what we did previously, if you're wondering why we need to do this twice, essentially here, this is just setting up the Alembic kind of connection here. This is why we're setting the configuration option here as well. So this really is just to do with Alembic. So here in our DB config, this is just everything else what that wants to connect to our database. This is why we're setting up the connection again. Right, so now we've got that in place. We're going to need to bring in some SQLAlchemy tools so that we can kind of just finish off our database configuration. Right, so let's bring in SQLAlchemy create engine. So this is a good time to consult Google if you're not too sure what the create engine does for you with our SQLAlchemy. Essentially, this is the starting point of building and allowing you to use all the tools with SQLAlchemy. Right, so let's bring that in, and what we're going to need to do here is just define our engine, if you like, which is going to be the link. So here essentially we are defining this engine from create engine and then defining SQLAlchemy database URL. So what we're going to need to do is bring in our SQLAlchemy database URL, which has obviously been derived from our environment variables. So here just OS environ, that's going to then access our environment variables. Obviously we've loaded them in here. Right, so that essentially sets up our connection now with SQLAlchemy and our database. Right, so with that done, let's now, we've got the declarative base in, so the only thing left we can probably bring in is, for example, the session. So again, this is a good time for you to consult the database documentation. This is just a website here called SQLAlchemy, and you can see and does describe here what the session is. So essentially what's happening here is we build a connection to the database, so we know how to connect to the database and obviously then how to manage that connection and so on. That just is all kind of managed by SQLAlchemy. And then here the session. So essentially we perform all the actions in a session. So a session is the primary interface for persistent operations. So here, before we can actually insert something into a database, we create a session. We use that session then to perform the actions. So let's go ahead and just set that up. So from SQLAlchemy.orm, scoop session maker, and then we're just going to define our database session at the bottom here. So scoop session maker, auto commit false, auto flush false, bind engine. Right, so that essentially allows us now to kind of define a database session ready for us to, when we want to insert or do something with our database. We'll see how that directly interacts with our database and is used once we start building our main file. So now we're ready to move on and migrate our models, or just our model in this case, to the database. Apologies. Right, so in order for us to migrate, let's go into main here, and I'm just going to add FastAPI, get that ready, and define that in app here. So that's just going to allow our that's just going to allow our app to run. So when we run the command here, when we build a new container, we're going to run the server and this app. So that just makes sure that we can run that when we bring up the app here. Now, what I also want to do with our app is I'm just going to set it to restart always. So let's go ahead and put that in. Oh, excuse me. So restart always. And then also I'm going to put the depends on here as well. So the PGAdmin depends, apologies, the PGAdmin here depends on the database service to be running. So I just added those two things in here. So let's go ahead now, and we're just going to build the image for our app. So we can run Docker Compose. We don't need to do this, we could just run Docker up, but Docker Compose build. So that's going to now build our image, our app image. So it's going to take everything from here and all the settings we've applied here, for example. It's going to build our image, and we now have an image here just called FApp. So that's our app. So now we can go ahead and Docker Compose, wrong command prompt. So now we can go ahead, and I'm just going to close these down. Let's now go ahead and use Docker Compose up. So that's just going to bring everything up. So that will be the app. That's going to be Postgres database and PGAdmin. So you can now see that we have 3 images. We now have our 3 containers running. So let's go ahead now and make a new command prompt here. And if you go into the commands markdown file here, you'll see there's 2 commands. And these are the commands that we need to utilize in order to actually make the migration. So first of all, we make a migration file, and then we go ahead and update the database. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So Docker Compose and then run. So essentially this is going to pass across this command over to the app container. So we're going to run the Alembic command, revision, auto generate -m, or the M flag switch, and then new migration. So this is basically going to make a new migration file. So let's run this. So we shouldn't get any errors. Okay, so everything's been done. So if we go into our Alembic folder structure here in versions, we're now going to see a new file here, which is our migration file. And you can see that this is basically describing what it is that's going to be built in and committed to our database. Right, so that's our migration file. So now what we can go ahead is run Docker Compose. We're going to run this command in our container, our app container. So let's go ahead and do this. So there shouldn't be any problems here if we've managed to make a migration. Okay, so everything has been migrated. Right, so now we can go ahead and have a look to see if that's been completed correctly. So let's go and access our PGAdmin. That's on the 5050 port. And we're going to need to log in and access our database again, because we're not persisting or we're not saving the data every time we kind of start up a container. So you can obviously set that up if you like. So add new server, DB, connection DB, Postgres is the username, and the password was password. So let's go ahead and do that. So we now have access to our database. We've got the post DB, the post database. So really that probably should be called blog database, shouldn't it? Okay, so we've got our tables here called post, and you can now see we've made a migration. So if I right click and view all data, you can now see that we've migrated our table, our model that we built, over to our database. So that concludes, if you like, part 3 here, phase 1, setting up all the database connectivity, migrating our model to the database. So now let's focus on actually building our API endpoints, saving and retrieving data from our database. So just make sure you've got everything installed here if you haven't already. So these are all the packages, libraries that we're going to need installed. We did that obviously at the start of this project, but you may have missed that step. So here we're going to be very much reliant now on Graphene. Right, so Graphene is going to allow us to implement GraphQL here. If you haven't used Graphene before, it's well worth having a quick read of that and maybe going through some of their documentation to get a general idea of how to utilize and what Graphene will provide us. So just before we move on to the next step, in actual fact, I just want to point out that I do have Docker running. So the next set of actions that we perform, I'm just assuming the Docker, all the Docker services are running. So whenever we update these files here, we'll update the container, the app container too. So if you haven't got all your services running, just go ahead, Docker compose up, just make sure that all the containers are running and working okay. So I can just remove some of these before you start moving on to these next stages. Now, because we don't have any data in our database, we are going to start, first of all, working with the mutation. So a mutation is basically defining a post, an entry data sent to our API that's going to be saved in our database. Right, so let's go ahead and, first of all, create a new file here. We're going to call this, schemas. Excuse me. Schemas.py. So I've got a microphone in my way, and I do touch type, but I keep swapping keyboards, and I keep pressing the wrong keys. Right, so we've got schemas.py. Right, so now we need to create our new kind of post schema. So here, essentially, what we're going to do is define what it is we want to save into the database. So class post schema, and this is where we're going to post data. And this is basically the schema. This is the format. This is the expected data that's going to be saved into the database. So just title and content. So that's created with a class. So what we're going to need to do here is bring in from Pydantic. So we are utilizing Pydantic to help us build schemas. So base model. So we bring that in, and essentially that now allows us to describe this schema here, which is title and content. If you go back into the commands, in actual fact, we will see in the requirements, where are we, that we didn't actually have to define Pydantic. When we installed SQLAlchemy, it would have installed that for us. So you can see here we've defined the title as a string, content as a string. So that now prepares, if you like, our schema. The expectation of data that's going to be sent from a user over to our API, and that's the format which it needs to be in. Title, content, it needs to be a string. Both type needs to be a string, and there's our schema. Right, so now we've got that. That's our schema. Let's go back in now into our main. Right, so from here we now need to work out a way of collecting data from the user and then saving it to the database. Right, so let's first of all create our new app route. So we bring in app here from FastAPI. That allows us to extend from app, and we can now perform actions that are based in the FastAPI toolkit. So for example, add route, that will allow us to build a new route, an API route. So let's define that. So this is our entry point into our Graph API, if you like. So that is just going to be GraphQL. You can change that to whatever you like, of course. It's just the entry point where we're going to point our front end, if you like, to get data from our API. So we've got that in place. Now we need to bring in GraphQL app. Okay, so that now brings that in. We can now define our schema. Schema equals, and that's going to equal Graphene. Dot schema, and then our query and mutations. Right, so we're going to need to bring in Graphene. So let's do exactly that. So that's just the import graphing. Yep. Okay. So that's graphing. Now let's, so it says the name, graphing not defined. So you can see that when we're updating these files, we're updating the container too. So you can see now that there was an error. I've updated and imported graphing. Now these libraries, they're already installed, of course. These packages are already installed on the container. So we've already pre-created our container. So we are working here within the container. Right, so now that's done, let's go over to our endpoint here. And you can see that if we run the root directory of our API, we just received detail not found. So let's now go to our new endpoint here, which is GraphQL, and that brings up GraphIQL, sorry. So wonderful. So if you've not used GraphQL before, this is kind of an area where we can test and check our API, and we can work with our API, our Graph API from here. Now, of course, you'll want to make a front-end app here and send requests across. Of course you will, but this just allows us to make sure everything is working. Right, so now we know that that is working okay. We've essentially now hooked up GraphQL and FastAPI. So remember, really all we're using a FastAPI here is kind of an interface to this root, and then essentially GraphQL takes over. Right, so now we've got this in place, we've got our endpoint. So now we need to think about creating a mutation. Right, so a mutation is basically Graph's way of saying add data, if you like. So let's add a new mutation. So let's just call this a post mutation. Mutations. So we've got a new class here called post mutations. That's going to be graphene.objectType. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to define a new mutation. New post equals create new post dot field. Okay, so we're going to make a single entry. We're now going to kind of extend from here, create new post. So this just identifies our mutation. So what we're going to find when we create our query, if we go into the commands here, I've already pre-created queries. You can see that we're going to define it, we're creating a mutation. So this is a query. This is actually going to perform the action of saving data to our database. So we'll run this shortly, but you can see it says create new post. So let's go back here. So you can see that matches up with this, create new post. And then what we need to do now is just pass in what we want, the data we want to add. So there's many ways we can do this in terms of handling this on the back end, but you can see that we're going to define what data we want to save to the database, in this case title and content. So that's all going to be hooked up nicely to our schema shortly. So you can see that what we want to take in is title and content. Okay, so that matches that. So now we're going to need to make a new class here called create new post, and we're going to pass in the data to that. Right, so let's just do exactly that. So let's create a new class here. We're going to call it create new post, graphene dot, and then mutation. Right, so what we're going to do here is basically just define, so class arguments. So what we're going to do here is just define title. So this is essentially what's being passed in. We're just defining what's being passed in. So this is going to be graphene.string required. So we're going to say it's required equals true. Okay, so we've got a title, and then the other thing we're going to pass in is the content. So again, required equals true. Okay. So what we can also do is set up this variable called OK or entry. So let's just do OK. So OK equals graphene boolean. So this isn't part of this schema. So this is something that we want to return. So if we do enter something in the database, the whole point here is that we're able to return true or false. So because we brought that in, let's go ahead and just make sure that we're bringing in graphene And we've got graphing string. Okay. Graphing boolean. Okay, so we're just bringing that in. Right, that's fine. So we'll see this in action shortly. I will be able to return this to check basically to see if this has been entered correctly. So if we return a true, then that means that the data has been entered. Right, so this sets up the data that we want to actually kind of insert into our database. We've defined it's a string, it's required. And then we've gone ahead now and we've got our Boolean to basically just try and confirm or kind of simulate confirmation that data has been entered. Okay, so with that done, we now need to create our actual kind of mutation. We need to actually save this data. So we're passing this data in. And now we need to save it to our database. So let's create a static. I'm having problems. I've changed keyboard. I'm having problems with the keys. So def mutate. So we're bringing root, for example, info, title, and content. So here, apart from the normals, we're going to bring in title and content. So that's going to allow us to define title and content in our actual query, if you like. So that's what we kind of expected. That's what we're going to pass into this. So when we create our query, here you can see that we've entered title and content. So that data is going to be passed in here. And now we need to do something with it. And of course, what we need to do is we need to actually save it to the database. So post equals post schema. So we're bringing our post schema because what we're going to do is we're going to check the data that's been sent across here to the schema. So we want to make sure, and we want to basically just test that that is the same. So title, let's take the title out, equals title. So title equals title, and then content equals content. Right, so what we're doing here, we're grabbing this data that's been passed into here, and basically we're going to use the post schema, which should have title and content. We're just matching that up, and we're just going to basically make sure that when the data comes in, it corresponds to our schema. Now our post schema here, that hasn't actually been imported yet, so we need to import that in. So from schemas, let's import post schema. There we go. So there's some issues there. Okay, so that brings in our data. We're going to check it against our schema. And now we've done that and everything is okay. Well, let's make the assumption it is. Let's go for db post equals models dot post title. So this is essentially building a query here, and we're going to build a query which is going to pass in our title and our content. So assuming that it's got past our schema and it's all okay, we're now going to actually build our query. So you can see what's happening here. Post is referring to post here, title is referring to a title here. So we're passing our title into this function, if you like, from our query. We're now checked it against our schema, and now we're using this variable here to access the data, title, and content. And we're going to then prepare this query to prepare that to be entered or inserting the data into a database. Right, so let's do db.add db post. Okay, so we want to add it to this table, db.commit, and then actually kind of commit it to the database. Right, so once we've done that, we can do kind of a db.refresh. db post, and then we can say OK equals true. So here we're actually going to define OK. So going back where we are here, we're going to actually return OK equals true. So we've set OK to equals true, and now we're going to return create new post OK equals OK. So that returns true basically. So basically if the data is OK, if it has been inserted, it has checked against the schema, if it has been inserted, into a database, and then we're going to return OK true, and that's going to be then returned to the user. Right, so that sets that up. Now notice that DB here, we haven't actually set up DB. Now going back to what we said previously in our database config, we said that we needed to set up a session in order to perform actions on the database. So we've already set up our DB session here. So we're going to need to bring this into main. So DB is basically going to equal DB session. So let's just bring this in the top here. So DB equals DB session dot session factory. Right, so let's first of all just bring in from DB config, DB session. So you can now see that our DB equals DB session. So basically what we've done here, we're now using our session to actually perform these actions here. Right, so models. Notice that we haven't actually brought in our models yet. So we're going to need to import models too. So allow that query to have access to our model so it can actually perform the action on our post table to update the table with new data, hopefully. Right, so with that in place, we've now have our mutation that we defined. We've connected that and we've now built our create new post mutation here. You can see that we've defined what title and content is. It should be a string, it should be required. We've then kind of allowed data to be passed in so it can then be readied and prepared and committed to our database, saved to our database. We return OK, which is true. So we return that to the user. That's what we've done there. And now we're ready to hook it up. So at the moment, if I just refresh, and we don't actually have anything here. I can't actually access our mutation. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is in our code, we're going to need to now define where to find this mutation. So in order to do that, simple, we just need to say something like mutation equals and then post mutations. So we're basically just hooking up our mutations there. So now we're ready to try this out. Everything should be set up nicely. So let's go into our admin. Now I've gone ahead and already tested this. So I've already added 2 items here. So let's just go back into the code. So if you need to know a little bit about the the actual query to run, I'm just going to copy this and I'll just explain what's going on here. It's fairly self-explanatory. So mutation. So we want to create a mutation. So where's that word come from? And why do we need to define mutation? Well, we've got this mutation here. So that basically just defines what we want to use mutations. Now we've defined all our mutations here. We may have more than one, but we're just going to use create new post. So in mutations, what do we find? Create new post. So we can work backwards here. So that's create new post. So now we're utilizing this mutation. Right, so create new post. Let's go back. So create new post. That allows us to enter title and content. That's what it's expecting. So here we have title. We're going to have a string wrapped up in doubles here. New title 1 and content, new content. So I'm just going to go to new content 2, new content 2. Right, so then we want to return OK. So we've got the brackets here, curly braces, sorry. And then this is what we want to return here. And that's OK. Remember, we set that to true and return. So if I press go, you can now see it says created post, OK, and true. Right, so that was new title 2. So let's go back into our admin area here. So I already entered new title 1 and 4. So I'm going to right click and refresh. And you can now see I've entered new title 2. So you can clearly see it has been entered into the database. I now have some data, and that gives you a starting point to think about building mutations and adding data to the database. Right, so from here, how you could extend this is just create a new mutation. Same kind of process applies, adding different data to the database. So now we know how to add data to a database. Obviously now we need to retrieve that data. So this is going to be a query. Right, so now let's go ahead and maybe above here, let's build a new class. We're going to call this query. And then we're going to take from graphene.object type Okay, right, so now we're going to run a query. So what we're going to need to do here is, let's get, for example, all posts. So let's build a new variable here, equals graphene. Now we want a list. So notice I used field before, defining the fact that we're just going to return a field, a single item. So it's worth having a look at the documentation for this. So this time it's going to be a list. It's going to be a number of different items. So that's important that we kind of follow this. So this is going to be post model. So this is our schema, if you like. So we're going to need to bring that in. So let's go back to schemas. So this is a schema, if you like, to define what information we're expecting when we create a mutation. So now we want to collect data from a database. So from here, I'm going to call this post model. Okay, I realize I'm kind of mixing up different terminologies here. So post model, and then I'm going to get that from SQLAlchemy object type. Okay, so I need to bring that in. So this is going to be from Graphene SQL. So this is where the Graphene SQLAlchemy package comes in handy. So we're going to import SQLAlchemy object type. So this requires a little bit of explanation here. So basically, have a little read through Graphene documentation on how to build, and maybe follow a few tutorials. I've got a tutorial set here on this channel where you can have a look at building with Graphene straightforward, and that will give you a kind of a better overview of what's really happening here. So essentially what I'm going to do here is just define a class meta, and that's going to bring in the model meta colon and that's going to bring in the model equals post. All right, so basically here I'm just basically building a way of accessing our model. Right, so that's post. So I'm going to need to bring in models. So let's from models, let's import post. So I bring my model in. That just allows me now access to this model. Right, so that is now set. So I'm then going to call that here. So from, oh, actually, I can do it here, post model. So I bring my post model, my post schema, if you like. So we now know what data we're working with. Right, so let's go back now and finish this off. So I've created all post. So that's what I'm going to refer to in my query, if you like. So now I need to kind of deal or resolve this, if you like. So let's now resolve this by, so resolve keyword, all posts, or post even. So that probably should be all posts. Right, so let's take in self and info. Okay, so now this function here is basically going to run a query. So I want to run a query, and that's going to be post model dot get query and then info. So I'm basically just grabbing the info being essentially the query, if you like, that's being passed in. So return, that's going to be query dot all. So I'm basically just going to return all the data that gets selected from the database, which should be everything. Right, so now I've got this in place. What I need to do now is hook this query up. So I've got mutations here. So let's go ahead now and just add query as well. So query equals, that's going to equal query. Simple as that. Right, so that kind of brings in my query. So now what I can do is I can run query and then run all posts to gather this information. So again, just go into the commands here. You'll see it's right here. This is the query, if you like. Let's go back into our graph. So we just kind of bring that in. And you can see here it says a query in the model base or session in the schema is required for querying. Okay, so it looks like we've got a small error. So the problem here is that I didn't bring in the query property when we run a query. So in the db config here, base.query equals db session query property. So when we run a query, that's going to basically fire up so we can actually run the query. So you can go ahead and read a little bit more about it. Query property here, return a class property of which produces a query object. So it's just one of those small things. Right, so now let's go back into GraphQL. Let's just run our query again, and we can now grab all the data from our database and return it. And of course, we can change, if we didn't want all that, we could just produce the content and so on. If you're not familiar with running GraphQL queries, and you can now see I can also select from a list if I wanted to, the information that I wanted to return. Because essentially what I've done here in the schema is I've selected everything. So by just selecting model equals post, I now have a range of everything, all the fields inside of that model. I can select any of those fields and return it. So here, for example, you can see that when I start typing, it produces a list of all the things I can now return. So I can select every single field and return every single piece of data about every item. So now we have input and output. So part of our CRUD kind of setup, if you like, create and return. So let's go back into main here now. Let's just update this. So if we wanted to select one item from a database, because typically you want to select everything on maybe a category page or on the front page, and now you want to select one individual item. So let's just extend here. Let's just create a new function here. And what we're going to do now is create the ability to pass in an attribute, if you like, into our function here so that we can then run it against a different query. So let's just call this resolve underscore post by ID. Okay, right, so self info, and then we're going to pass in post ID. Right. Okay, so now we've got that in place. We want to return a db.query. And that's going to be on the models.post. So we're going to run a query on the post, and then we're going to run a filter. So that's going to be models.post.id. So we're going to run a filter on the post ID. That needs to equal the post ID that we send across. And then we're just going to just make sure that we return the first item. Not that we really need that, because there should only be one post with that individual ID. So that returns one item. There we go. So that's our query there. Hopefully that makes a little sense to you if you've not utilized that before. So this post ID that we pass in is going to be utilized on this filter on this post table to return one item. Right, so now we've got that in place. We need to obviously set this up. So this is going to be called post underscore by underscore ID. That's going to equal graphene dot. Now we want to return one item, so field, and then that's going to be post model. So we're going to use the post model, and then post underscore ID equals. So essentially what we're doing here is just setting up that attribute that we're going to pass across, and it's going to be required. Going to make it required equals true. Okay, so there we go. So that's basically just defining the data, post ID data. It's going to be passed in, it's going to be utilized for the query. It's going to run that query. Right, so there isn't anything else we need to do here. So let's go back into our commands. Now let's have a look at the actual query. So I'm just going to copy this in. Right, so you can see what's happening here. Now, post by ID. Let me just refresh, sorry. So make sure you refresh. So post by ID. So that's what we're now running. Now we want to pass in post ID of 2, so we want to get the second post, and then this is the data we want to return. And there we go, so the ID of 2 there, and then title, new title 1 referring to the, well, let's just have a look, see what data we got here. So post ID 1 has title, new content, title 4, so it's a little bit confusing, I do apologize. You can use history here, let's use history. Let's create a new post. Let's call this new one. Content, let's call this new one. just so we know what we're doing here, let's so we've added a new post here, new one. Right, let's go into our admin. Let's run and have a look, see what ID this is. So new one is ID 4. So when we select post 4, it should return new one and new one. Right, so let's use the history again. Let's go back to this query here. So when we run 4, it should return the new post that we just created, new one. There we go. And there we have it. A simple kind of baseline introduction to utilizing FastAPI and GraphQL, Graphene. So hopefully that was useful for you. Hopefully that's given you some insights now on how you might want to start developing with FastAPI and GraphQL. So as always, I thank you for listening. Hopefully, like I keep saying, it was useful. Please give me some feedback. If there's anything you want to know, if there's any questions, please ask in the comments. I can't always get back to all the comments. I try and answer as many comments as I can. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.